stories from urban explorers who encountered something far more sinister than crumbling walls and broken windows. Our first story comes from Marcus, an experienced urban explorer who thought he'd seen everything the abandoned world had to offer. He was wrong. Marcus had been exploring derelict buildings for over 5 years when he decided to check out an old psychiatric hospital that had been closed for decades. The place had a reputation among local explorers as being particularly eerie, but Marcus wasn't one to be deterred by spooky stories. He arrived at the sprawling complex on a cold October evening just as the sun was setting behind the skeletal remains of the building. The hospital was massive, with multiple wings connected by long corridors. Most of the windows were boarded up, but several had been pried open by previous explorers, creating perfect entry points. Marcus chose a window on the ground floor of what used to be the main administrative building. As he squeezed through the opening, his flashlight revealed a scene of complete devastation. Overturned desks, scattered papers yellowed with age, and wheelchairs positioned at odd angles throughout the hallway. The smell of mold and decay was overwhelming. But Marcus had experienced worse. He spent the first hour methodically exploring the ground floor, taking photographs and videos for his urban exploration blog. Everything seemed normal for an abandoned building of this type. But as he made his way toward the stairwell to explore the upper floors, he began hearing sounds that didn't belong. At first, it was just occasional creaking, which he attributed to the building settling. Old structures make noise, especially when someone is walking around inside them. But then he heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. The distinct sound of a door slamming shut somewhere above him. Marcus stood perfectly still, listening intently. The building fell silent again. He reasoned that it could have been a door blown shut by wind coming through one of the many broken windows. He continued toward the staircase, but with heightened awareness. The stairs themselves were in surprisingly good condition, considering the state of the rest of the building. As Marcus climbed to the second floor, his footsteps echoed in the stairwell, but just as he reached the landing, he heard something that sent chills down his spine. Footsteps that weren't his own, coming from somewhere above him. These weren't random settling sounds or wind-related noises. These were deliberate footsteps moving at a steady pace across what sounded like the third floor. Marcus called out, thinking perhaps another explorer was in the building. His voice echoed through the empty corridors, but received no response. The footsteps stopped. Against his better judgment, Marcus decided to investigate. He climbed the stairs to the third floor. The corridor stretched out before him, lined with doorways to what had once been patient rooms. Most of the doors hung open, revealing small spaces filled with debris. Marcus methodically checked each room, calling out periodically to announce his presence. He was about halfway down the corridor when he heard the footsteps again. But this time, they were behind him, coming from the direction he had just explored. He spun around, his flashlight illuminating the empty hallway. Nothing, but as he stood there, he could swear he heard breathing that wasn't his own. Slow, deliberate breathing as if someone was trying to remain hidden while staying close enough to watch. That's when Marcus made a crucial decision. He started backing toward the stairwell, keeping his flashlight pointed down the corridor. As he reached the stairs, he heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of multiple doors slamming shut in rapid succession, starting from the far end of the corridor and moving toward him like a wave. Marcus didn't wait to see what was causing the disturbance. He ran down the stairs and through the ground floor corridor, not stopping until he had climbed back through the window he'd entered. Once outside, he looked back at the building. In several of the third floor windows, he could see faint lights moving around, as if someone was carrying flashlights or candles. The next day, Marcus contacted the local police to report possible squatters in the building. When officers investigated, they found evidence that people had been living in various parts of the hospital for months. They discovered sleeping areas, food storage, and makeshift living spaces throughout the complex. What disturbed the officers most was finding several rooms that appeared to be set up for the specific purpose of watching and trapping anyone who entered the building. Our second story takes us underground to the vast network of abandoned subway tunnels beneath a major city. Sarah, a photographer specializing in urban decay, had heard about a section of tunnels that had been sealed off for decades after a fire damaged the infrastructure beyond repair. Getting access required navigating through active subway tunnels and climbing down through a maintenance entrance that most people didn't even know existed. Sarah had done her research, timing her exploration for the early morning hours when train traffic was minimal. The abandoned section was like stepping into another world. Unlike the clean, well-lit active tunnels, this area was completely dark and filled with the accumulated debris of decades. Sarah was particularly interested in photographing the old station platform that existed in this section. According to her research, it had been a beautiful example of early 20th century tile work and architectural design. As she made her way through the tunnel toward the platform, she documented everything with her camera. The platform, when she finally reached it, was even more stunning than she had expected. Despite years of neglect, much of the original tile work remained intact. Elaborate mosaics depicted scenes from the city's history, and ornate columns supported the arched ceiling. Sarah spent considerable time setting up shots and capturing the haunting beauty of this forgotten space. She had been working for about 2 hours when she heard something that didn't belong in this underground tomb. Music, faint at first, but definitely music. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the tunnel system, beyond the platform where she was working. Sarah's curiosity got the better of her. She packed up her camera equipment and followed the sound, which led her through a narrow maintenance tunnel that branched off from the main line. The music grew louder as she progressed, and she began to make out what sounded like multiple voices singing. The tunnel opened into a large chamber that had clearly been modified from its original purpose. The space was illuminated by dozens of candles and battery-powered lanterns arranged around the perimeter. In the center of the chamber, approximately 20 people sat in a circle, singing what appeared to be some kind of chant or ritualistic song. Sarah's first instinct was to back away quietly, but her movement must have caught someone's attention. The singing stopped abruptly, and every person in the circle turned to look at her. Their eyes reflected the candlelight with an intensity that seemed almost inhuman, and their expressions were completely vacant, as if they were in some kind of trance. One of the figures, an elderly woman wearing tattered clothes, stood up and began walking toward Sarah. She spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but in the acoustics of the underground chamber, every word was clearly audible. The woman began describing things about Sarah's life that no stranger could possibly know. Her childhood address, the name of her first pet, details about family members who had died years ago. As the woman spoke, the other figures in the circle began standing up and moving closer. Sarah realized she was in serious danger. She turned and ran back through the maintenance tunnel, hearing footsteps and voices pursuing her. The narrow passage amplified every sound, making it impossible to tell how close her pursuers were or how many were following her. When she reached the main tunnel, Sarah could see the glow of an approaching train in the distance. She had to make a choice: risk crossing the active tracks to reach the exit, or continue running through the abandoned section and hope to lose her pursuers in the maze of tunnels. She chose to run for the exit. As the train approached, she sprinted across the tracks and threw herself onto the platform of the nearest active station. The train passed, and when Sarah looked back toward the abandoned section, she could see figures standing in the tunnel entrance, watching her, but making no attempt to follow her into the active part of the subway system. Sarah reported the incident to transit authorities, who conducted an investigation but found no trace of the group she had encountered. However, they did find evidence that people had been living in the abandoned sections for extended periods, and they discovered several chambers that appeared to have been used for gatherings of some kind. Our final story comes from David, an urban explorer who specialized in abandoned industrial sites. He had received a tip about a derelict manufacturing complex on the outskirts of town that had been closed for over a decade. The facility had once produced automotive parts. David arrived at the site on a Saturday afternoon, planning to spend several hours documenting the decay of industrial infrastructure. The main gate was secured with chains and warning signs, but like most urban explorers, David had become skilled at finding alternative entry points. He discovered a section of fencing that had been damaged by weather, creating an opening just large enough for him to squeeze through. Once inside the complex, David was struck by the sheer size of the facility. Multiple buildings stretched across several acres. David started with the main production building, a massive structure filled with abandoned machinery and assembly line equipment. Conveyor belts stretched through the space like frozen rivers, and robotic arms hung motionless above workstations that would never see activity again. As David explored and photographed the space, he began noticing signs that he wasn't the first person to visit the abandoned factory. There were footprints in the dust, fresh scratches on some of the machinery, and areas where the debris had been disturbed recently. But it wasn't until he reached the administrative section of the building that David realized the true extent of the facility's current use. In what had once been the main office area, he discovered that someone had set up an elaborate living space. Multiple rooms had been cleaned and furnished with salvaged furniture, creating a hidden apartment complex within the abandoned factory. The setup was sophisticated, with electrical power tapped from a nearby utility line, running water accessed through the building's still functional plumbing, and even internet service somehow obtained. It was clear that whoever was living here had been doing so for an extended period and had invested considerable effort in making the space livable. David was documenting this discovery when he heard voices approaching from deeper within the building. He quickly hid behind a large piece of machinery, hoping whoever was coming would pass by without noticing his presence. 3 men entered the office area, engaged in a conversation that immediately made David realize he was in serious danger. They were discussing plans for an upcoming criminal operation, using terminology that made it clear they were involved in activities far more serious than simple squatting. One of the men mentioned security cameras, and David realized that his presence in the building had likely been detected. As the men continued talking, they began systematically searching the area where David was hiding. David made the decision to try to escape before they found him. He quietly moved toward what he hoped was an exit, but the building's layout was confusing, and he quickly became lost in the maze of corridors and rooms. The men had apparently split up to search for him more efficiently. David could hear them communicating with each other through radios, coordinating their search and blocking potential escape routes. David found himself trapped in a section of the building with limited options for escape. The windows were too high to reach, and the only exits led back toward areas where he could hear his pursuers searching. In desperation, David managed to access the building's roof through a maintenance ladder. From there, he could see the extent of the criminal operation that had taken over the abandoned factory. Multiple buildings were being used for different purposes, with vehicles coming and going through a hidden entrance that wasn't visible from the main road. David used his cell phone to call police while hiding on the roof. When officers arrived, they discovered that the abandoned factory had been converted into a sophisticated criminal operation involving drug manufacturing, weapons storage, and stolen goods distribution. The investigation that followed revealed that the criminal organization had been using the abandoned facility for over 2 years, taking advantage of its isolated location and the fact that local authorities rarely patrolled industrial areas that appeared to be genuinely abandoned. These 3 stories demonstrate that urban exploration carries risks that go far beyond structural collapse or environmental hazards.